I want to show y'all two free online resources that anybody can go look up. We'll do this quickly and then we'll take a deeper dive into history. This first one is a new article that I wrote with George Gibson for a new magazine called Symposium. If you type in Symposium, you do a search for Symposium spelled this way with the words Banjo Heritage, you'll pull this article right up. I recommend you do that and read the whole thing, and especially read everything that George Gibson says, everything with a GG next to it. Let's look at this nice picture of me and George taken a long time ago, 10 or 12 years ago. So George introduces himself. I'm going to skip over this, but please do go and read this. This does not have to do with the early history of the banjo, but it's very relevant to the songster method and our course in general. So I'm going to read this. He kind of summarizes our thesis here. So George says, by the time I began playing banjo around 1950, most banjoists had switched to learning the style of three-finger picking pioneered by Earl Scruggs, who in the 1940s popularized what came to be called bluegrass. However, I had a neighbor named James Sloan who still played traditional banjo. There was no formal method of teaching banjo in the rural South, so I learned banjo as Southern musicians always had, by emulation. So here's that word again I've been trying to use. There was no formal method of teaching banjo in the rural South. So you learned by emulation, which is what banjo players in the South had always done. They learned by emulation, not by imitation. We're going to talk about that in a second. So emulation, what is that? I listened to Sloan's playing, I watched what he did, and I tried to reproduce the sounds that his banjo made. By doing this, I ended up with my own style, not a copy of Sloan's. Most people today learn by imitation from teachers, tablature, and books and magazines. This has led to the spread of the standardized style popular today, known as round peak or claw hammer. It's the same thing. It's become the same thing. And it all has also led to a loss of diversity in Southern playing styles, which before were not homogenized. So this paragraph's very important. That is what we're trying to do with Banjo Heritage here. We experienced a cultural bottleneck coming out of World War II. We lost a lot of that culture. Most of it was lost. And now there's just it's just claw hammer and round peak, and bluegrass is really what passes for traditional banjo today. And it's just really not the case. There used to be a massive, dazzling diversity of styles before the Second World War. And as I've mentioned before many times, every time we go through a world war or a major pandemic or a Great Depression or an industrial revolution, something of that magnitude, we go through, as humans, we pass through a cultural bottleneck and we lose culture. We get new culture in the process. We may not always like it, but we lose culture every time. I'm going to leave this article alone. Again, please go look up Symposium and Banjo Heritage and read this full article. It's full of great passages like this, but we just don't have time for everything. Let's go to the next. This is really just a little bonus I want to show you. This is on the maryland.gov website. Anybody can pull this up. If you do an internet search for African instrument and colonial Maryland, you'll pull this article right up. It actually goes all the way back to 85 is when they recovered these artifacts, but this article wasn't printed until 2015. So in 85, they were excavating the Addison Plantation site in Prince George County, Maryland, and they excavated a well, which had, typically historic wells, they dry up or nobody lives there anymore for whatever reason. They start backfilling them. They get filled up with garbage, and archaeologists love old well shafts because you can date stuff real easily. You get this perfect cross-section of refuse and whatever people wanted to hide for the time it took to fill the well up. So it's pretty neat. In the waterlogged portion of the lowest section of the well, which dates to the early 18th century, there was a lot of preservation of wooden fragments. Among these wooden fragments were a bridge and a tuning peg from a stringed instrument. Oh, that's really exciting. So, and this is an enslaved residential context as well. I don't know if they mentioned that in this article, but I've read elsewhere that they're pretty sure this was near the slave quarters. This was probably a well that was used by enslaved workers every day. And this is a tuning peg and a bridge from a musical instrument that was probably handmade by a slave. Really interesting. So the bridge appears to be hand carved. It has 4 clear notches for strings with a possible 5th notch. So you can see the 4 clear notches. This is the notch that a lot of us have tried to see a 5th string slot. I just don't know if I see that. There's definitely 4 strings, but most early gourd banjos appear to have been 4-stringed. It could also be a bowed fiddle type instrument with 4 strings. That would explain that. But typically the sound table of the fiddle is arched. So the bottom of a fiddle bridge is arched, the feet are arched, and so is the top of a fiddle bridge is typically arched to match the arched fingerboard and the sound table. But on a banjo, the fingerboard is flat and the sound table is flat. So this, to me, it does look like it's a very good candidate for early gourd banjo paraphernalia, which is really fascinating. Okay, I'm not going to read any more of this article. It's really good. They talk about Daniel Jatta. You should look him up. Jatta, Daniel Jatta. It's a good article, so look this up, folks. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do, I have a little video prepared. It's only about 10 or 11 minutes long, but it's going to take you on a really fun, deep ride with lots of pictures and music, and it's going to take you from the earliest possible banjo sightings in West Africa in the 15 and 1600s, all the way up until the banjo starts really hitting the big time in the 19th century. So everybody sit tight and relax and enjoy the show. In 1620, English trader Richard Jobson described a gourd instrument played by mixed-race Luso-Africans on the Gambia River in West Africa. Quote, "They have little variety in instruments. That which is most common in use is made of a great gourd, and a neck thereunto fastened, resembling our bandora. But they have no manner of fret. Notwithstanding, with pens they wind and bring to agree in tunable notes, having not above 6 strings." End quote. Jobson's mention of pens that can be wound to adjust the instrument's tone sound remarkably like European-style tuning pegs. If so, this may be our earliest description of a gourd banjo. Early gourd banjos, like Jobson's Luso-Africans, were an Atlantic Creole phenomenon combining both African and European traits. The instrument basically consisted of a gourd drum with a flat, wooden neck and twisted fiber strings. A floating bridge raised the strings over the drumhead, allowing them to be plucked with the fingers. Each string was also adjusted by a wooden tuning peg, including at least one short string that was plucked exclusively by the thumb. In 1627, also on the Gambia, a Jesuit missionary, Alonso de Sandoval, observed, quote, "Spanish-style guitars, although made of rough sheepskin." End quote. Sandoval may have been describing early gourd banjos. However, like Jobson, his report lacks the necessary detail for a complete identification. In 1687, Sir Hans Sloane encountered another gourd instrument, this one played by enslaved Africans in Jamaica. His well-known sketch depicts the gourd body, tuning pegs, and flat fingerboard of an early gourd banjo, but seems to lack its short thumb string. Therefore, we cannot say with certainty that these are early gourd banjos either. It's really not until the early 1700s that banjos begin to clearly appear in the historic record. For example, we have a banjeel reported in Barbados, 1708, the banjur in New York, 1736, and finally the banjo in Pennsylvania, 1749.
the 18th century, thousands of African Americans migrated west and south along the early frontier of colonial America. In his deeply researched 2018 article, Black Banjo, Fiddle, and Dance in Kentucky, Appalachian historian George R. Gibson says the following, quote, "By 1728, runaway slaves were being sheltered by pioneers on the Virginia and Carolina frontiers. The early frontier was an open and fluid region where, of necessity, convenience, and sheer pleasure, individuals appropriated cultural habits from others and, in so doing, altered their identity." Most of the free African American families documented in Virginia and the Carolinas before 1800 traced their lineage to the union of a white indentured woman and a black enslaved man. This gives us some idea of the profound extent to which black and white Americans exchanged culture, ideas, and music along the early southern frontier. In 1781, a wagon train of white immigrants, some traveling with their slaves, crossed from Virginia into Kentucky. Quote, "The moving train included church members, their children, Negro slaves, and other immigrants, between 500 and 600 souls, and was the largest body of Virginians that had ever set out for Kentucky. They toiled over the Blue Ridge and Buford's Gap. Some of the women were already in tears when Captain Ellis spoke to one of his Negro men, whose willing hands began at once to make a well-worn banjo talk. Like magic, the signal passed along the dusky lines of chattering slaves who trudged beside the wagons with their bundles on their backs. Soon one of the jolliest of the old plantation songs resounded from one end of the train to the other. The merry Negroes sang as only the old-time darkies could. The children screamed with delight, and the immigrants descended the mountain road with lighter hearts." End quote. Monk Estell and Cato Watts are two of the first African-American musicians that we can actually identify in the historical record. Though fiddle players, both men lived on the Kentucky-Virginia frontier during this period, and they may have collaborated with early banjoists like the one described in our last quote. By 1800, at least one white Appalachian had learned to make banjo strings out of deer gut. Surprisingly, this rough backwoodsman, known to his neighbors as Old Leatherstocking, was said to value his banjo as much as he did his food and clothing. The term breakdown was often used to describe Southern folk dancing in the 18th and 19th centuries. Gibson has the following to say on the subject. Quote, "Dance was a major factor for the banjo enduring in the folk culture of African Americans and common whites, and was the vehicle by which the banjo and fiddle traveled west and south from Virginia and Maryland." In 1774, a white observer described one Maryland hoedown. Quote, "A great number of young people met together with a fiddle and banjo played by two Negroes. I believe they had danced and drunk till there are few sober people among them. I'm sorry I was not able to join them." End quote. That same year, a school teacher in Virginia described a similarly hip music scene. Quote, "This evening the Negroes collected themselves into the schoolroom and began to play the fiddle and dance. Ben and Harry were of the company. Harry was dancing with his coat off." And again, "This evening in the schoolroom several Negroes and Ben and Harry are playing on a banjo and dancing." End quote. Another observer described a similar scene in 1780s North Carolina. Quote, "Young folks would join in a regular old-fashioned Virginia reel and keep time with flying feet to the delightful strains drawn from a gourd banjo." End quote. Note that the North Carolina dancers are accompanied by a solo banjoist of unknown ethnicity. Baynard Hall, writing of his experience in 1820s Indiana, described, quote, "Light streaming through a Negro hut where, on Christmas Eve, the merry rascals were dancing away to a cornstalk fiddle and a calabash banjo." End quote. By 1830, the banjo's popularity had spread as far west as Arkansas, where blacks and whites, quote, tripped lightly to the tunes drawn from horsehair strings and the gourd banjo. Archibald Ferguson, described as, quote, black all over except in color, is the most mysterious of the early identified white banjoists. He shows up in the record just long enough to introduce famous minstrel Dan Emmett to the banjo, then quickly disappears. James Holliday, a plantation heir from Maryland, was playing the banjo by about 1750, having learned the instrument from his mother's slaves. Robert McAlpin Williamson, born on a plantation in Georgia about 1804, was permanently crippled from tuberculosis by the age of 15. It was around this time that he learned to dance, pat juba, and play the banjo from his father's slaves. On the other hand, while we do have some names for early black banjoists, going back to at least the 18th century, these individuals, all of whom were enslaved, they were only identified in passing. For example, we know of people like Toby and Scipio, and that they were banjoists only because it's mentioned in runaway slave advertisements. And those were in 1748 and 49, respectively. Also, there's another individual that I want to talk about briefly is this guy named Banjo Jack. We only know about Banjo Jack because he was listed for sale at the Baltimore Iron Works in 1751. To find a black banjoist who enjoys anything approaching the fame of some of the early white performers like Emmett or Sweeney, we'll have to wait until Horace Weston arrives on the scene. Weston, a free black man born in Connecticut in 1825, did not officially debut on the minstrel stage until he appeared with Buckley's Serenaders in 1863. That's right in the middle of the American Civil War. He would go on to become the first African-American entertainer named on a playbill when he toured Europe as part of a production of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1873.